Hi, this is Lisa, and I wanted to say thank you so much for listening to this episode of the No Fear Cast. We are starting a new episode series, and we're really excited about this one. But we just wanted to take a moment of your time to ask you to do a few things for us. If you could help us spread the word about this podcast, it would be amazing. You can do that by leaving a rating or review at your favorite podcast hosting sites like iTunes, or tell your friend who also loves podcasts and loves horror. Just let them know about our podcast. And you can also, if you wish, go over to our Patreon. Patreon members, for a very small fee every month, get weekly episodes. So you would get to hear what I hope is your favorite podcast every week. Thanks.
Exorcisms are usually private events. Priests are called into homes or hospital rooms under the cover of night. The rites are shrouded in mystery. The mystery of it perhaps explains our fascination with it. After all, the public is rarely given full access to this ritual. But in 1634, the town of Loudun, France, held a public exorcism for what was considered a mass possession. Who was the possessed? An entire convent of Ursuline nuns who were strapped to chairs set up on a raised platform. And while they screamed in demonic voices, they were exorcised of their demons in front of a rapt audience. This is the No Fear podcast. We know what scares you.
Hi, I'm Matt.
I'm Mel.
I'm Lisa.
And this is the No Fear Cast, the podcast where we dissect horror and all the things that scare us. This is Season 2, Episode 6, and this is the first episode of our brand new series on possession and exorcism. This episode, we are exploring the more traditional side of possession and the role religion plays in these narratives.
In the opening, Mel described what is often referred to as the Loudun possessions. That was my best attempt at French, so please don't write in and tell how bad it is, because I'm a Mississippi girl. But what I find really interesting about that particular moment in history is it was essentially, when you boil it down to its essence, a witch hunt. You had women who were acting as if they were possessed by the devil, possibly in league with the devil and doing the devil's bidding, familiar to anyone who has ever read Hawthorne or any of the witch trials over here in the United States. But what was particularly, I think, interesting about this is that there was an actual exorcism that was performed in a lot of these cases. And there was a precedent before this particular one. I think this particular one just has become infamous in part because it was a mass exorcism. It was done on pretty much the entire convent at once rather than just on one particular person. And it was a rare occurrence of a public exorcism. So something that was performed in front of what I would imagine to be a pretty large audience. And it's gained even more infamy after Ken Russell made it into his 1971 film, The Devils, which has quite a large cult following and I believe is still playing on Shudder. So if y'all haven't seen that yet, I highly recommend first getting Shudder. It's wonderful for horror movie lovers, but checking out that movie, The Devils, because it deals with a little bit of the history in kind of a really fantastical way. But Mel, you were telling me there was other possessed nuns in France at this time. It was kind of a trend, I guess you'd call it.
Evidently the first 25 to 50 years of the 1600s in France was kind of the peak of a witchcraft hunt. And there were a number of cases involving demonic possession in different towns. Also, my French is horrible, but in 1611, in the town of Aix-en-Provence, there were more Ursuline nuns who were possessed. And just like in Loudun, you had a priest who, according to gossip, was engaging in not so priestly relations with women in the town and possibly nuns. And, so we all know how, a kind of, I don't really want to use the word hysteria per se, but the line between like religious ecstasy and things that churches define as sins is probably pretty thin. And so you have a lot of priests and nuns outnumbering, I guess, civilians, you would say, as the possessed victims. And also it seemed to be kind of a trend, at least I believe it happened in Loudun, but which was public, so people saw it, but there was a bit of a trend of the priests who were exorcising nuns would then become possessed. Almost like it was catching or something. But the Provence case was interesting because it set a legal precedence. The priest involved was tortured and gave up names and then was burned, similar to in Loudun, where the priest in question, his name was Urbain Grandier, was tortured, refused to give up names, and then was burned. So by the time we get to 1634 in Loudun, they've seen this before, or at least heard of this before. But one of the things I think is kind of interesting is there always seems to be very secular things involved. For example, Grandier had kind of pissed off people in power by writing all these treatises on how priests should not be celibate and writing satirical portraits of Cardinal Richelieu and various other people in power. And so folks in the church hierarchy were just looking for a reason to get rid of him. And when the nuns became possessed, which there's a question as to whether they were using it to get back at him, since some of the evidence that was discovered was in the handwriting of one of the nuns at the convent. It seems like this was kind of a way to get back at him. I'm not saying he was a great person, but it seems like it was more personal and political conflicts working their way out throughout these relationships. I'll put it that way.
Well, that's often the case with a lot of these stories that are taken from history. Because as you were talking about this, and not that there's really a connection to make, but my strange brain made it. But when you're talking about like somebody like Elizabeth Bathory, who everybody likes to hold up as like the blood countess and the first female vampire, and she bathed in the blood of virgins to keep herself young. And when you really start looking at the history of it, it seems like it was more of these wild accusations that were made because of some, either political motivations or more likely people just wanted to get control of what she had and she was an easy target. But it sounds like from what you're telling me that may have been playing a part at least a little bit in some of these so-called possessions.
Yeah, and I think Grandier kind of knew that people had it in for him because he actually insisted after the first breakout of possessions before the public exorcism that the nuns be sequestered. And I can't remember who it was he spoke to, but he spoke to someone higher up in the church hierarchy, and they helped him to get the nuns sequestered. And when they weren't together, it seemed to kind of die down. But then it came back again once, I think it was the bishop of, I guess it'd be Poitiers, which was the area that they were living in, who had kind of an axe to grind with Grandier, kind of got back involved. So, it's unclear as to whether the leader of the Ursuline nuns, I'm not sure I guess that she would be a mother superior. I'm sorry. I apologize to Ursuline nuns if I'm incorrect about the name of the presiding nun there. But it's unclear if she also had an axe to grind with Grandier or if she was manipulated by people in power to pursue this course. But most historians, one of the pieces of evidence was supposedly how they did this and still remained pure, I don't know. But one of the priests involved, I can't remember if it was one of the actual exorcists, because there were two exorcists for the public exorcism, or if it was one of the bishops, procured the pact that Grandier had made with the devil and various other demons. And the pact was supposedly plucked from like the desk of the demon Asmodeus, and how you as a mortal can steal a written pact from the devil's or the demon's cabinet. I'm not quite 100% sure, but Most historians seem to think that the handwriting matches the Mother Superior's handwriting. And I highly recommend to listeners to go online and find a picture of Urban Grandier's alleged diabolic pact with the demons. The signatures are fascinating. Demons evidently don't use letters to sign their names. They draw interesting pictures to represent themselves that involve a lot of pitchforks and oblong heart-looking things. It's really kind of weird. The one in the middle looks like graffiti more than anything else. But yeah, so something was going on. But like in all possessions, it seemed like the way that you could tell that the nuns were possessed was by their, how else to describe it, their highly sexualized behavior. So the nuns, possibly a few that had been in a relationship with Grandier, we don't know. We're describing having these illicit, highly detailed dreams about him. They were making, if you're familiar with Blatty's The Exorcist in 1971, they're making animal noises, they're convulsing, they're making obscene gestures at the priests exorcising them and at the crowd around them. They're using obscene language, and they're being marked. Even when the Mother Superior was cured of her possession, she retained a mark on her hand that I think was like the names of Jesus, Mary, and Joseph or something like that, to kind of show that she had gone through this horrible situation. It was fine again. And then she was kind of put on display, like, look, everything is okay and done now. It's very highly emotional and performative, like all possessed behavior has always seemed to be. There's kind of a pattern in it.
Yeah, one thing I find so interesting about that is as you're describing everything that happened, and I had read similar accounts of what the possessed nuns did and how they acted, and you used the exact right word when you said performative, because it definitely had that feel. And of course, the exorcism, they had an audience, so performative really does fit. But everything that you've described, it sounds to me, possessions have not changed at all over the past, few centuries, really, because just the idea of, a formerly chaste woman, or even, innocent girl, and in some of the stories that I'm sure we're going to get to, some of the texts that we're going to get to, acting in some sort of lewd way, or profane language, or obscene gestures, and the writing on the body. None of it seems to have changed that much. And I find it really interesting that, I think this is one thing that I mentioned to you before when we were getting info together for this episode, is that it seems, and I know that there are cases of exorcisms that involve men, but it seems to affect women more, or at least in the text, we want to talk about the women more. And I think it's because there is literally a fight over the body. These women are fighting presumably a demon for control of their body. And then there is a male exorcist standing on the outside, also kind of lording over her and jumping in that fight as well. I don't know. There's probably a lot to be read into that performance that she's given. But yeah, it really did kind of set the precedent for the possession narrative that we know now today.
Oh, yeah. I guess demons figure if it ain't broke, don't fix it. It's like, we'll just keep doing the same thing. It seems to work. But while you were talking, I was thinking of all the kind of complexities of that. Possession and exorcism is so difficult to discuss because you have all sorts of questions of religion and morality, and then also that extend to the political and the personal and the cultural aspects of wherever you are as well. But you're right. Especially in fiction, a lot of, I don't know numbers, but I have read in the past when I was reading about exorcism that more young men undergo exorcism than we think, because at least in our fictional portrayals, we tend to see younger women. And I think there is something to that, what you're talking about, the battle for the woman's body. Because if you're thinking, if your story is, if the audience that's watching or the reader that's reading is meant to believe that a male demon is forcing this chaste nun or young girl to do these heinous sexual things or say these things they shouldn't know, then the woman is kind of the powerless victim, right? Like, even though you have to invite demons in, for some reason, demons seem to be able to get into these pure women. And then people insist, rightly so, just, that these women are still pure because it's the demon doing the horrible thing, not the woman. So all of the woman's agency is like completely erased, and she's just like this thing that the male priest has to get away, like has to fight with the demon over. It becomes a religious kind of battlefield. Even in later books, like, well, to mention The Exorcist again, which I know we'll talk about, so I don't want to mention too much, but when I was reading it for this episode, there's this moment where the demon says to the priest at the end, like, part of your pride is that you see this girl as a battlefield for our contest, that you're not trying to save her life, you're just trying to fight me. And it kind of like erases the woman from the equation. But then I was thinking to myself, if possession is a psychological thing, or if you're a woman who doesn't have a lot of power, or if you're a woman who's held to like this impossible standard of purity, or you're just like a normal human being and you're stuck in this hugely repressive milieu where even the pictures you see of religious ecstasy are sexual in some way, your performance is going to be sexual. So like, let's say you're not actually possessed and you're acting like you're possessed. You are then doing that. You're doing something that is taboo, and when you're doing it publicly, that like ups the ante in some ways.
Yeah, I joked when we were preparing for this, and we were talking about the Ludun possessions. I said that it sounded like it was something right out of a Matthew Lewis plot line. These overly sexualized nuns who are acting out in public while these men try to contain them. But exactly what you were talking about, this kind of repressed religious state of trying to remain completely pure and chaste while you're looking at these, what are often sexual ecstasy pictures. And that is almost exactly what happens in an early scene in Matthew Lewis's The Monk, when I'm blanking on character names right now. But when, I guess, is it the monk who looks at the picture in his room of Mary? It is.
I'm not sure. I don't want to say because I'd probably be wrong.
Yeah, it's been a while since I read it, so again, my memory may be fuzzy. But there is a moment of that where one of the characters looks at what is meant to be a religious picture and basically begins to have like a sexually charged feeling, I guess, for lack of a better word, towards the picture, and is kind of conflicted about that. But at the same time is drawn to it even more. And of course, that book ends in a demon, I think, flying him off a cliff. So I think one of the messages there is that kind of that is a dangerous road to go down, because that's everything that you're told not to do in these religious contexts, I guess.
Oh, and the Gothic is really anti-Catholic too. So, right, you're going to see the repressed sexuality and connect it to violence.
Oh, absolutely. And, we've kind of been dancing around this, so I feel like we might as well just go ahead and kind of lay it out for everyone. When we talk about possessions, there are multiple kinds of possessions other than just demon possessions, and we're going to get into all of those. But when you talk about possessions as they relate to exorcisms in particular, that is when you get very firmly rooted into this Catholic tradition. And so there are a couple of things that you almost have to accept. You have to accept, number one, that the demons are real, although some later texts will kind of play with that a little bit and question the validity of that and whether or not you're dealing with some sort of psychological issue or aftermath of an abuse maybe. But for the most part, when you're talking about the big one, which of course would be William Peter Blatty's The Exorcist, you kind of have to accept that, yes, there is a demon, and yes, this demon has taken over this person's body. And then you have to then accept the power that is the Catholic Church, because it is almost always in these cases of exorcisms, and when you're looking at these exorcist narratives, it is almost always a male that is sent from the Catholic Church to do this. And that's a lot of kind of hoops of faith, I guess, to jump through to begin to accept what these narratives are. I don't know. I find that really interesting, because there aren't many subgenres of horror that require that much effort on the part of the reader to accept certain things as true before they can continue on with the narrative.
That's interesting. Though, there still is a lot of ambiguity even with real possession, though, right? Because, even the Catholic Church, like going back like centuries, but particularly in the last couple centuries, has made steps to say, like, exorcism is only like a last resort. Like, first you have to look at every physical or psychological reason for what could be happening, which I think is kind of interesting. I don't know if in the 1600s they were as picky as now. Unfortunately, in the 1600s, witchcraft trials were happening all over the world, and lots of people were getting killed. I do think it's interesting that even with the religious interpretation, there's still this idea of like, well, you have to be absolutely sure that either the person is going to be saved by the exorcism because they believe so much themselves they're possessed that they need it psychologically, or that there's not something that could be fixed with medication or care, because it could be dangerous to put someone who is having a psychological or physical problem through the ritual and the rigmarole of like going through the exorcism itself, that it's so taxing.
Right. Well, and you even have to go through those questions even before you ever get up to the point of an exorcist, right? Before an exorcist even comes in, is
mm-hmm. And then you have to get permission. Like, it goes up the hierarchy until you have to convince several people.
Right. Yeah. In my reading on what the Catholic Church, what they're willing to talk about, at least, I guess, with real life exorcists and real life exorcisms. Yeah, it is quite a process to go through. And there are apparently these rogue exorcists that are roaming some parts of the world and just kind of performing them without the blessing of the Catholic Church. And they've spoken out pretty harshly about those, because I think they really do see it as a form of ministry on their part. And so as such, they take it very seriously, and they want to make sure that they're actually dealing with a demon possession and not, as you said, something else. But at least in fictional cases, I think that hasn't always been the case, because, and maybe I'm wrong in this, but with somebody like William Peter Blatty, I feel like he kind of answers the question for us, and we're just supposed to go along with the ride of that text. As in, he wants us to go in and accept that Regan is indeed possessed by a demon, and there's really no ambiguity. And the tension of the novel doesn't hinge on is she or isn't she, but will they vanquish the demon?
The one priest's faith is at stake. The one who's a psychologist who is investigating as to whether she requires an exorcism or not, because he doesn't really believe it until the exorcism, fully believe it until the exorcism is actually happening. He's constantly second guessing himself that maybe there is a psychological explanation. But definitely at the end, the fact that she was possessed by a demon is pretty clear.
Right.
And it cements his faith too, because the end is basically him defeating his doubt and sacrificing himself for her. But I did think that was interesting, because it's you're right. Like, she's possessed the whole time, and it as a reader. But it's kind of like that particular priest's journey to deal with his inner demons. Haha, pun there. with his grief over his mother and his relationship to her and the fact that his faith in God is slipping and his work as a counselor and a psychologist and all that. And then he's called in to help this girl, and he, even like when they start the exorcism, is still wondering if he did the right thing. And it seems like the exorcism not only saves her, but it also saves him too, even though he doesn't necessarily make it. I'm sorry, spoilers, but I figure if you're listening to this podcast, you've read the book and watched the movies. So
well, and I think that anything that has come out in 1971, there's been enough time for readers to go and find that text should they want to.
Well, I also figure if you really want to be in the dark, you can always fast forward and come back after you've checked it out.
Right. And well, and I guess that's what I mean when I say that Blatty really answers the question for us, because it's if there is doubt, it's early on, and in giving us the journey of the priest who's kind of still finding his faith, and his faith is reaffirmed at the end. It is that kind of missionary exorcist narrative where you're getting souls that are literally being lost and fought for and found again. So you're seeing souls that are restored, and that is a very Christian idea, but it's also a very Catholic idea. And it's interesting that when you talk about this subgenre, everybody wants to talk about his novel, and it is such a Catholic novel.
It is. Well, he's a Catholic writer.
Right. Well, it makes sense, right?
It does. You're right about the conversion, because there is an indication at the end that the atheist family who was possessed might be thinking about religion differently if you read it in that way. And of course, Lou Dunn went down in history as a major conversion event, right? A lot of the Protestants in the area saw that exorcism and was like, okay, I'm going to change teams now. So, yeah, I think exorcism is a conversion event for that one soul, and maybe the people doing it and their families. And then if you do it publicly, it could be an experience that gets transferred, not just from individual to individual, but to the whole town or the whole area. It becomes a spectacle.
It does become a spectacle. And in a lot of the true life, I guess, exorcist stories that I found online, and a lot of these were just kind of personal accounts, and so you have to take them with a grain of salt, but several of them started out very similarly, I think, to like The Exorcist or things that were coming out around the same time, which was an atheist family finds themselves fighting a battle with the devil or a demon, and goes to various sources and cannot find help until they go and find a Catholic priest. One particular, again, this was like a true life, I lived through an exorcism type story you find on the internet, but they were like, we knocked on the door of the Baptist church and we went to the Methodist folks down the road. And finally, nobody could help us until we went to the Catholic church. And so it does become that kind of conversion tale very specifically for the Catholic religion. But what I find really interesting are I love The Exorcist. That was one of the first horror movies that I ever watched and really loved. And so it will always kind of hold a place in my heart, I guess, for that reason. But what I really find interesting are these stories that are taking that trope or that convention and kind of turning it on its head and leaving room for the doubt to exist, even once you end the story. Something like, before it actually, and I know I've mentioned this before in other podcasts, but I'll keep mentioning it because I love it, is Ray Russell's The Case Against Satan, which came out in 1962. And it's a very similar story of two different priests going in to an exorcism, and one of them is convinced it's a demon possession, and the other one has his doubts and has more of a psychiatric background and is there to check everything out. And it's very much a story where the questions are left unanswered and the doubt kind of still lingers, much in the same way. And I know we've talked about probably this before, but I really am curious to hear what you two think about this, is Paul Tremblay's Head Full of Ghosts, which came out in 2015. And I will go ahead and just put this out there. If you haven't read the book, stop, go read it, and then come back, because we're probably about to spoil it a lot in our talk.
Or just fast forward at least 5 to 10 minutes or so.
There you go. There you
right. So, Matt, you've read the book, right?
Yes, I have. It's very, very good.
Okay. Yeah, I always get so excited when I'm talking to other people who've read the book, because I don't think I'll ever tire of talking about it. I don't know. You want to give a brief summary of the book before we jump into all the cool things he does?
Yeah, I think, well, it's kind of a hard thing to summarize, but I guess the basic overview is that it's a story about a girl who may or may not have been mentally ill, or may have been actually possessed, and the family gets convinced to have the exorcism part filmed as part of basically a reality show miniseries kind of thing. And it kind of alternates between the actual plot of that happening, and there's also this blogger who is writing a review of it some 20 odd years after it aired, and sort of describing and analyzing some of the things that happen in the filmed and aired TV show version. And I'm trying to avoid some spoilers here, but should we not worry about that too much? I know we gave the warning.
Yeah, I think we can talk about it without telling everything that happens towards the end. Okay. Because I think that's the biggest spoil. But yeah, we will spoil some other things, but we'll try to save the ending for those of you who are still listening and haven't read it.
Yes. Well, I guess what I'll say to just sort of start it off, that's not just the summary, is that, like you, I think what I like the most about it is that it really does play with that idea of the genre, and it really does play with the idea of whether or not the girl who's possessed is actually possessed or just mentally ill and not getting the treatment that she needs. And it really does leave that thread hanging pretty much throughout the entire novel. And I don't feel like I even got a satisfactory answer even when I finished it. But what's really cool is that it's not from her perspective, it's from her younger sister's perspective. And so you've also, of course, got that unreliable narrator kind of thing going there. And yeah, it's I mean, you don't know who to trust and who to believe, and what's, actually demonic and what isn't, and what's been, misconstrued through, I don't remember, how old was the younger sister, like 12 or 10?
Yeah, she was like a preteen, I think. I mean, she was at the point where she's old enough to kind of sit up and pay attention to what's happening around her, but still young enough that she doesn't know how to put everything into proper context.
Yes.
Yet.
That's a really good way of describing it.
Yeah, and so you get that kind of unreliable narrator, and I think she's at the age where things just generally scare her. She sees her older sister changing in ways that are unexpected, and that would be frightening enough alone without her parents then inviting cameras into their home to document everything. And then, of course, you have a film crew that's around. And so she has interactions with the film crew, and the people there are telling her things that she wouldn't normally know because she's hearing them talk about it, or they're telling her about it. And you start to wonder, well, how much are they feeding her the narrative of the TV show that they're filming? What they want to put out there, or how much of it is actually really happening and they're just catching it on camera. So you have that element of it. And he does this really interesting thing with religion. And this is why I wanted to talk about his book right after we talked about William Peter Blatty, because Blatty, as we said, was a Catholic writer, and he's writing a Catholic story. And Head Full of Ghosts manages to be both a story about religion and then a story about an exorcism that doesn't have religion in it at all, which is a hard thing to accomplish, because part of the beginnings, I guess, of the story is that the father is the one who's really pushing this whole exorcism and possession narrative forward in their family. And we learn that he has recently undergone some sort of spiritual awakening and is now part of this, I mean, what I would call kind of a cultish, but definitely maybe more fundamentalist Christian group. And he's unemployed, so he's kind of sitting at home all day, and you wonder if he isn't just a little bit bored. But he's become kind of obsessive in his religious views, and you could easily see how if one of his daughters is now having some psychiatric issues or some mental health problems, that he's now suddenly going to view it through this newly found religious lens. And that colors and shapes how you read the story as well, because that certainly doesn't take away the possibility that it could absolutely be a real possession. There were things in the text that would support that reading, but it also makes you question it a whole lot more, in the exact same way that having that news camera or the cameras there make you question it too, because they suddenly have a vested interest in capturing something supernatural that's going on. And man, it all leads to one of the absolute best climaxes I've ever read in a book. And like we said, we're not going to spoil the ending for you, but several times I said, oh, kind of, oh my gosh, I can't believe I just read that.
Yeah, it's
it was shocking.
It was shocking. And definitely it was kind of hard to read too. The book itself, there's some really good, very tense moments kind of peppered throughout. I'm thinking of, and Lisa, you'll probably remember this, the little cardboard house and all of that happens, or that kind of in the middle of the book, in the middle of the night. There's some things that happen there that have good tension, but man, the building of the tension and the climax of the book is, you can feel it rising and you can feel where it's going, but even when you get there, there's still some shocks that you may not have expected, and it's definitely yeah. I like to read it at night, kind of before going to bed, and that's how I read this book. And I really wish I had not done that, because I did not sleep that night when I finished the book. I couldn't put it down because I was almost finished, and it was that good, but it got, yeah. I wouldn't say I was scared, but it definitely, the things that happen definitely kept me from sleeping, if that makes sense. Yeah, scared isn't the right word to describe the emotion that you feel. Disturbed. Yes, that's a good one. That's
disturbed, and unsettled and tense. Yeah, but I hope, if you haven't read it, that we're really selling this novel, because I can't tell you how much we love it. But yeah, I think for me at least, when you're looking at the progress that the Exorcist novel has made, he's the one, I think, who's really doing the most modern take on it, because I have a hard time today believing that so many people can just accept a purely Catholic view of this type of story. Like, I don't think if William Peter Blatty was writing today that his novel would have had the success it had back in the 70s. I just, I think that those type of stories are a little bit harder. I mean, even when you look at things like, I guess a similar story structure might be like the James Wan movies, like The Conjuring. What's the couple's name in those films?
The Warrens.
The Warrens, right. Even now, like, we'll watch something like that, and I think those movies are meant to present the Warrens as really out there fighting some sort of demonic presence in each of those films. And the Warrens themselves certainly, I think, would have wanted you to think that. But even when those movies came out, audiences were immediately questioning what the Warrens were doing. were they actually out there fighting demons, or were they just kind of these showmen who were out for, book deals and to promote their museum? And yeah, I think people really were questioning that in a way that maybe a 70s audience wouldn't.
Yeah, I can see that. And I think, too, at this point in time, maybe it's because Blatty's book and then the subsequent movie were so iconic that it really feels hard to, like, everything just feels like an imitation of that. So many other possession stories just feel like, oh, well, it's just like The Exorcist, which I think that's where Tremblay really gets things. It does things really well. He brings this more 21st century sort of outlook onto it with the reality TV and the constant, the presence of cameras and how that would change things and that sort of thing, and takes a new spin on something that, it's really hard to take a new spin on, because I even think of something like, what was that movie in the mid-2000s, The Possession of, was it Emily Rose? Is that right?
Oh, the one that took place in a courtroom.
The Exorcism of Emily Rose.
Yeah.
Right.
I feel like that one, it's a good movie, but there's only so much that one can add to the genre, and the originality sort of suffers, if that makes sense. And
no, it does.
Everything post-Exorcist really is so much in the Exorcist's shadow that you have to really stretch out and go outside the box to make an impact. And Head Full of Ghosts does that. And another book that we may not have too much time to talk about in this episode, but My Best Friend's Exorcism by Grady Hendrix is another one that really shakes the mold a bit and breaks it. But
Matt, I think you're really onto something with that, because when you're dealing with an Exorcist story that is post Blatty's The Exorcist, you don't want to come across as an imitator. And to do that, you have to offer some sort of twist. So the ones that stand out are like The Exorcism of Emily Rose, which of course was set mainly in a courtroom and people on trial for, what may have been a, gross misconduct handling a potentially mentally ill person. And you have, similarly, like the last Exorcism. I don't know if y'all remember that film that came out in 2010. And you had an exorcist going in, and this is again where it echoes, I guess, Blatty's novel in a way. You have an exorcist who does not have any faith and has ample doubt that, there are actual demons who could possess people. In fact, he has built his career on being basically a showman, faking exorcisms so that he can, or I guess faking the demon possession so that he can fake exorcise those fake demons. And then he comes across a real one and is forced into a journey of faith over the course of that story. And again, when I named the plot, that sounds almost identical to Blatty's novel. And I think the only reason something like that stands out is because Patrick Fabian and Ashley Bell, who were the stars of the movie, did such a fantastic performance that those movies stand out. But even those, when you just boil it down to, here are a few sentences on the plot, Blatty already did that. So let's move on to something else. And I think Head Full of Ghosts was really the first one that you thought, hey, this is something new. This is something completely different. Even though it's dealing with a potential demon possession and a possible exorcism, religion is dealt with in a completely different way. And there's really no journey of faith that anyone goes on. And I don't even know if I could categorize it in any sort of way other than that it's kind of on its own. And My Best Friend's Exorcism, the Grady Hendrix book you mentioned, does that as well. But I know we're running out of time, so we may have to save that for our next full episode. Yeah, so since we are running out of time, I feel like I need to at least give an honorable mention to the TV show Supernatural, because they've done just about every demon possession you can. There's been lots of exorcisms, so I guess they owe a lot to Platty too.
And angelic possession. Don't forget the angelic possession.
Yes, which I don't want to tease out too much what we're going to be talking about, but we will talk about in future episodes possessions by things other than demons. So maybe some angelic possessions, maybe some ghost possessions. I don't know. So I hope you've enjoyed this discussion, and I hope I have intrigued you just a little bit to hear the episodes on possessions that are coming your way, because I'm pretty excited to talk about all of it. And thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.